I've been asked to give my opinion on an ambitious new vegan movement called Direct Action Everywhere. And I don't want to sound like a jerk, and I don't want to sound overly negative or overly harsh or critical. However, I live in a city where Direct Action Everywhere doesn't exist. They don't have a chapter here. And what I know about them is simply based on the way they define themselves on their own website and some lectures and public statements made by one of their founders and leaders, a guy named Wayne Hsiung. Now, it is to Wayne's credit that he sets the bar high for himself. He openly states his intellectual aspirations as well as his political ambitions. He states his own sort of pedigree in terms of the books that have influenced him, the professors that have influenced him, and so on. And as such, he invites a fairly high level of scrutiny for his ideas and for the plan that he sets down and sets out as being directly informed by the conclusions of social science research. So with that being said, it may come as a surprise to Wayne that some people, such as myself, who could be his strongest supporters, actually have a lot of apprehension and skepticism when looking at the material he's creating that he may imagine would appeal very strongly to someone like myself. My first diploma is in political science. I have a serious political interest in veganism and social movements and social change of various kinds. Anyone who sincerely cares about the very recent history of what's called the Arab Spring, basically talking about from 2010 to 2015, most of the big events people remember in 2011, anyone who sincerely cares about that history would be somewhat nauseated by the cynical use that Wayne makes of the history of the Arab Spring in presenting his case for his preferred method for vegan activism. The history of the Arab Spring at this point has a tremendously high body count, and anyone who hears what Wayne has to say about it, I mean, whether or not you care much about politics, would have to wonder, look, Wayne, have you read even one book about the politics of Egypt or of any other country that's been involved in the Arab Spring? The Arab Spring covers a lot of territory and a lot of complex political histories. But it's grim, and of course, in the last few years, most of the optimism has disappeared from evaluations of what happened, why it happened, and what the outcomes were. Now, that doesn't mean I'm offended in a childlike way by the idea of a vegan talking about the Arab Spring. If you have a sincere interest in it and your opinion is informed by the facts, with or without any sensitivity to those facts, by all means, say whatever you've got to say. But when I'm hearing and responding to the manifesto-like declarations that Wayne Hsiung is making on the basis of his very strange interpretation of the Arab Spring, I'm certainly disappointed. I don't think Wayne lives up to his own hype. Now, the other examples that he chooses to cherry pick from the political history of the world and kind of dumb down and misrepresent and use to further his aims are slavery, the civil rights struggle of the 1960s, and gay rights, gay marriage, equal rights for gay people, and so on. And none of those are used in an intelligent or nuanced or well-informed way. I don't really feel like harping on at length about that, and most people would probably respond very negatively if I were to launch into a kind of heavy, detailed critique of how Wayne Hsiung represents or misrepresents the history of the abolition of slavery in the United States. However, he doesn't mention it casually or flippantly or in passing. He very seriously, and with allusions to published work, and with the weight of his own academic background as a former professor of law, he really presents in all seriousness his interpretation of the abolition of slavery as setting down the framework for his approach to veganism. Now, there's so much wrong about what he has to say about slavery. Again, I'm not offended in principle that somebody would want to pose a comparison. In some specific sense, somebody might be able to pose an intelligent and interesting set of comparisons between the history of the abolition of slavery and what's going on in veganism right now. But Wayne Hsiung fails to do that. Instead, you have the sense of a self-righteous and ignorant and cynical, misrepresentation of a few select facts here and there that, among other things, completely omit to mention the American Civil War, completely omit to mention the significance of violence and leadership and executive action and so on. I mean, in terms of the misrepresentation he's making of the abolition movement, the American abolition specifically, I mean, to begin with, that's already a question. Like, the way slavery was abolished in Haiti is very different from the way it was abolished in the United States of America. In Haiti, there was a real grassroots slave rebellion, a rebellion from the bottom up, a real revolution. That was how slavery was abolished in Haiti. In the United States, it was a much more peculiar and contradictory balancing act. The Union forces that fought the war to abolish slavery, more than 90% of them were white. This guy named Abraham Lincoln ended up making a coalition of all these abolitionist parties, many of whom had sworn they were pacifist and would never support violence. But then when Lincoln started putting together his plans, soon enough they did indeed support the Civil War and so on. It's a very strange political history. Again, anyone who's sincerely interested in it and was making some kind of intelligent or well-informed commentary on what this has to do with a bunch of vegans on a website trying to start a kind of informal community and to organize street protests against foie gras or against government subsidies for the dairy industry and meat agriculture. It's tenuous at best. It's a real stretch. But sorry, coming back to what use Wayne is making of these historical anecdotes that both have nothing to do with one another and have nothing to do with veganism. The use he makes of slavery, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, gay rights movement, and the Arab Spring. He's using them to support his peculiar view of what used to be called leaderless resistance or acephalous resistance, but that he's here instead presenting as a social network model of protest activism and social change. And, I mean, the parts just do not fit. That model he's presenting, which already I have problems with. I mean, if we're having a serious intellectual discussion about activism and social change, already to me, he's setting forth a very problematic and debatable set of ideas, and he's setting them forth as if they were the unassailable conclusions of the social sciences, as if the social sciences have conclusions that work like an objective checklist of here's what to do next for vegan activism. Whereas in reality, the social sciences present us with the most murky, uncertain, and debatable of provisional suggestions based on events that are open to interpretation. I dare not digress to say more on that. This social network theory that he presents with the very casual example of how people on the internet select pop music to listen to, how they choose to listen to one song rather than another song, and without even paying money for it. How possibly do you connect that argument to the decision made by hundreds of thousands of people to fight to the death in the Civil War to bring about the abolition of slavery? Now, I'm well aware that the abolition of slavery was not the only issue in that war. It was not the only reason why people joined the army. However, it was one decisive issue, and I'm here speaking with brevity. What do those two ideas have to do with each other in any way, let alone any of these ideas, like his very facile use of what happened during the Arab Spring, and this model he's putting forth that on the one hand is an idea of community reduced to people giving each other the thumbs up on Facebook, which is not a community. And on the other hand, this sort of contrived outrage of a particular type of street theater, a particular type of protest that, I'm not opposed to. I don't have any agenda against this style of protest. But it doesn't seem to answer any of his stated methodological concerns, because he stated that he was disappointed with the outcomes of the types of political protest and activism he had previously been involved with at the University of Chicago. I think that for him and for Direct Action Everywhere as an organization started a series of questions being asked, and those were good questions, to do what we call outcome evaluation in the social sciences, to say, okay, what really gets results and what doesn't. However, it seems to me that Direct Action Everywhere started with all the right questions, and they haven't yet come to the right answers. And that's fine. I mean, the future of the organization may be bright. However, the purpose of this video is to say, when I, as an outsider, look at the case being presented by Wayne Hsiung, I am turned off. I'm given a negative impression of this organization and what they're about. And I'm sure that's the furthest thing from their minds. I'm sure they don't see anything wrong with what they're saying about slavery, the civil rights movement, etc. And they are very proud of what they have to say about the politics of outrage. But what I see is a tremendously facile, intellectually dishonest approach to the issues. And it doesn't show any sincere interest in or concern for the real history that has a real body count for the issues being invoked. Again, to repeat myself, the Arab Spring, U.S. Civil Rights Movement, and slavery. And it's not out of sensitivity. It's not because people are easily offended that I would ask them to either research those matters more deeply or say nothing of this sort. It's not out of a tendency to censor. It's just out of my sense that, people like Wayne Hsiung, who seems tremendously confident in the message he's delivering, in my eyes, he's making a fool of himself. Now, to come back to this sort of twinned issue, on the one hand, the methodology of Direct Action Everywhere is supposed to be a community. And I've really got to put a footnote to ask, what do they mean by community? Because it's not what I mean by the word community. And then the other hand, they have this whole praxis of the politics of outrage. And that is ostensibly based on Wayne Hsiung's analysis, although I think his analysis is worse than what you can hear on CNN, of how it was outrage that sparked the Arab Spring, and it was moral outrage that brought about the abolition of slavery in the United States of America. Yes, the Civil War had nothing to do with it. Moral transformation. Well, again, as political arguments go, it's certainly common to pick and choose. But yeah, in this case, it's a bit chilling to see the extent of the misrepresentation of these facts to suit his theory. And then beyond that, he has this whole methodology of trying to focus on beliefs rather than behaviors, of saying that presenting people with facts does not bring about changes in outcome, that veganism can't be a facts-based movement. It has to be an ideological movement, a beliefs-based movement. All right, so I have a lot of problems with this. And I'm sure people in Direct Action Everywhere wouldn't expect other vegans to think this is problematic. But I do not regard vegans as people who are united by their beliefs. I regard vegans as people who are actually divided by their beliefs, as people who have tremendously diverse political beliefs, religious beliefs, and so on. And Direct Action Everywhere is not promising something to me that would strengthen the movement, but instead promising to weaken the movement or separate it into smaller parcels with this emphasis on belief and ideology. And now many parts of that ideology are left unstated. Wayne repeatedly alludes to and invokes a very nebulous notion of progressive politics. Well, Wayne, your idea of progressive politics may not be the same as someone who grew up Hindu and who within Hinduism was familiar with the concept that animals' lives are worth something, was taught that cows were sacred, and then at one point figured out that the dairy industry was both unethical in that it exploited cows and caused suffering to them, and bad for the environment, and who made the move from mainstream Hinduism to veganism, let's say an ecologically and ethically motivated veganism. That could be the basis for a real community and for a real political impetus long-term in veganism. I do not think in general that public, which is already significant in countries like the United States and Canada, it's going to be even bigger in India, but Hindus who shift to veganism they are not going to be stereotypical, progressive, left-wing, liberal, white Americans. They're going to have a very different set of beliefs from you, including very often on issues like gender roles, gender politics, marriage, what kind of hairstyle you should have, and so on. I could insert here, of course, a long set of remarks about Buddhism and the status of veganism within Buddhism. Within the next 20 years, I think there's going to be more action in Hindus becoming vegan than there will be within Buddhism. That's my bet. I think both of those, Hinduism and Buddhism, are going to create much more durable communities or bases for communities than teenagers on the internet who post pictures of themselves wearing balaclavas and posing as armed radicals. If you're a gambling man, you can place your bet too. Sorry, coming back to what I felt were the broadest issues raised here. On the one hand, Wayne Hsiung and Direct Action Everywhere talk about community, which is problematic, and on the other hand, they're talking about the politics of outrage. And they don't really spell this out. I mean, Wayne just puts up the image of Martin Luther King Jr. and invokes the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. And really what he's doing is calling up the shallowest understanding possible of what the role of outrage was, the politics of outrage in the history of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. He's summoning up an idea of what brought about legal changes and social changes based on, still images on the nightly news, the image of policemen beating protesters, the images of outrage of people in the streets being sprayed with hoses, attacked by guard dogs, and this sort of thing. Those moments of outrage, they're often featured in high school textbooks on history. They're featured on the nightly news. But this really does not give you any kind of insight into the substance and the body and the basis of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, why it worked and how it worked, and how they managed to combine people who had very, very different political beliefs into one movement. That is something that vegans should maybe look at and try to learn from. But anyone who's read even one book about civil rights in the United States would immediately recognize that Black American churches were a huge part of what made it possible for someone like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to take a lecture tour from coast to coast and move from church to church. Another type of institution that was tremendously important were the black colleges, what we now call historically black universities. Again, these provided real communities, real units of social organization, social capital, if you like that term, that existed before the civil rights movement got underway, and then really provided the stage for the civil rights movement to unfold on. And, those units of social capital were not produced by outrage. And also, I just want to add, as I was saying earlier, they encompassed a tremendous diversity of political beliefs and religious beliefs. Obviously, if you're talking about South Carolina, a lot of those black churches that got involved with the civil rights movement were extremely conservative, and by today's standards might be considered right-wing. On the other hand, on some of the black campuses and in some of the big cities, there were socialist organizations and communist organizations involved with the civil rights movement that were extremely left-wing, and all kinds of other combinations in between. And, part of the civil rights movement was the challenge of getting those people to work together on a particular program. So in the history of the civil rights movement, it's very misleading to just look at this moment of outrage, which is in some ways the end of the process that went on for decades, if not a whole century, of many small, largely unseen political struggles that built up those communities, that built up the levels of trust and cooperation within a church, between a church and its leader, within different social movements. Little struggles that may have included, having a picnic and a raffle to raise money to help someone who was in the hospital and couldn't pay his hospital bills, going and visiting someone in prison, the community organizing to try to get the person a fair trial. Thousands of tiny struggles over decades. and building up social cohesion and trust in these types of institutions that were indeed scattered around the whole of the United States, and that the civil rights movement was, to some extent, able to organize and galvanize, partly by doing relatively fun activities. You know, a huge part of the civil rights movement at that time was actually having groups of musicians go from town to town and town to church, and lecturers, including Martin Luther King Jr., often traveled with those musicians, and then, this excited people and got them even more active, involved in the movement. Okay, now my first point was this whole history has nothing in common with the argument for veganism that Wayne Hsiung is offering. Any parallel to veganism, I think, is very hard to construe, and there is a certain kind of lack of sensitivity and lack of sincere interest in the facts of history in this approach. With that having been said, as soon as we really pose the contrast sincerely, I think what's important for us to recognize is precisely that the type of social capital, the type of community building I've just described, is exactly what the whole vegan movement is lacking, definitely in the United States and Canada. We don't have church groups across South Carolina. We don't have vegan colleges in Georgia. We don't have that. We don't have anything like that anywhere in the world, but definitely not in the United States and Canada. And again, if you were going to look pragmatically and honestly at who might have that, who might have the basis for forming a community and those types of institutions and that type of trust, it will probably be Hindu groups, maybe in a few cases Buddhist groups, that are now making a shift from one type of vegetarianism, maybe more heavily based on supernatural concerns, to another type of veganism, maybe more informed by ecology, ethics, and so on. So I'm not just saying this to kind of heap scorn on the frankly idiotic use of the history of slavery and civil rights that Wayne Hsiung has made, and that in my eyes gives Direct Action Everywhere a bad name. I'm also doing it to draw attention to this peculiar contrast I see between all of the rhetoric about outrage, about the politics of outrage, about how moral outrage is supposedly going to transform the vegan movement, transform the world, and the promises that Direct Action Everywhere is making about providing a community. I think that's easy to boast of. It's easy to promise and very hard to deliver on. I think if you really thought about it with all due humility, think about how much of a struggle it would be for any vegan organization to even do what a small Protestant church in the American South does for a community in terms of community services and in terms of building cooperation and trust and so on in a community. Good luck. I mean, search all over the internet. Good luck finding any example of a secular vegan organization doing that. And, practically, if you're looking for a community, if you want a community to do for you the things that a community really does, that can include helping you with daycare for your children, through to helping you with a funeral for your grandparents, you can today find that pretty easily through religious organizations, through some cult-like organizations. In the past, probably some left-wing groups would provide you with a community. Not lately so much. I don't think vegans are doing it anywhere in the world. And when I look at the promises of community being made by Direct Action Everywhere, I'm skeptical. I wonder, can they deliver on that promise? And are they taking that seriously? Or is this just another website that says it's going to conquer the world, but doesn't provide you with much more than the links to a couple people's Facebook pages and encouragement to go stand by the side of the road and hold up a sign saying meat is murder? I want to end this by saying, if I did live in a city where Direct Action Everywhere exists, I would happily go to a meeting and meet whoever was involved and just decide on a case-by-case basis, are these people I can work with? Are these people who are trying to make something positive happen? Can I cooperate with them to try to do something positive? And I don't assume that the actual formal definition of Direct Action Everywhere presented by Wayne Hsiung, I don't assume that it's like a constitution that everyone in Direct Action Everywhere knows. I don't assume that everyone particularly agrees with it or follows Wayne as their great leader. I assume that, like most websites, anyone can sign up, and you probably meet good people, bad people, and all kinds of people who happen to get involved via that website and via that organization. So the point of this video is not to rain on their parade, but maybe if some people at DxE see this and think about it, they'll start to think about how the rhetoric they're indulging in may be alienating some of the people who could be their most highly motivated supporters. When you talk about the Arab Spring, think for a minute about how this would sound to somebody who's a refugee from the Arab Spring living here in Canada now. Think about how it would sound just to somebody who really has some sincere interest in the ongoing politics of that situation, which again is politics of the body count. When you're making these types of very amateurish statements about the history of slavery, how do you think that sounds to someone who really cares about that history?